Hi everyone. We are today with Erika and Holly. Holly Yanacek is an assistant professor of German at James Madison University, USA, and Erika Quinn is professor of history at Eureka College, USA. I'm so glad to have both of you today here. We are going to have an interesting conversation ahead of us, and it's been like I always say a long overdue conversation between among us, actually, Holly and Erika. And welcome to the show. How is it going, Holly?
Thank you so much for the invitation, Tilani. I know we had this conversation. You had invited us earlier in the fall, and the semester ended where I teach at James Madison University. So I'm glad that we can finally have the opportunity to talk with you. And
Absolutely. Yeah, Erika, how's it going for you? You're busy with your semester.
Oh, things have been winding down here, so I'm starting to shift into a more restful mode. And I also just want to say thank you for including me on this podcast. It's a great topic, and I'm excited to talk about it.
No problem at all. So we will start off with one of the common areas that the two of you are working together: emotion studies, the history of emotion. I would first like to ask Erika, how did you get into this field? And then I would like to move on to Holly.
That's a big question. Part of me thinks I've always been in this field and I didn't know what it was called. My dissertation research, my first book was about the piano virtuoso Franz Liszt and how he had multiple expressions of subjectivity, and he would shift between these, I called them different selves or different subjectivities, in order to more fully express himself, get the acclaim he wanted, etc. And I've always been interested in identity and what makes us who we are, and emotion is a huge part of that. I started really looking at war, widowhood, and bereavement, and that it's been, I think, 15 years that I've been working on that topic already. And I didn't really encounter emotion studies for many years. There was kind of a gap in the literature that so much of what they were talking about was discourses around bereavement and social welfare programs. And I kept asking, what about the people, the women's own experiences? What were they thinking and feeling, and how did they negotiate through that? And slowly I kind of found my way to emotion studies, and the German Studies Association has an emotion studies network, and they've offered lovely seminars that I really benefited from. So it's been kind of a circuitous journey, but it's very, very interesting and very, very relevant.
Holly, what about you? How did you get into the field?
So I would say that I got into the field about the same time. I was introduced to the specific area of research, the history of emotions, also through the German Studies Association. And I was looking for a methodology for my dissertation. And originally I started graduate school, I was interested in writing on the age of Goethe and early 19th century works, Romanticism. And then I discovered realist literature. I became fascinated with how emotions are represented and how scholars would talk about this period and as a period of repression. And I wanted to complicate that narrative and to look at specific emotions. And then I learned that scholars in anthropology and history were historicizing emotions and looking at the kind of complexity, the discursive negotiation of feeling rules. And so I was introduced to the work of scholars at the Max Planck Institute Center for the History of Emotions in Berlin. And the director there kindly invited me during my dissertation writing year during a Fulbright in Berlin to learn from her researchers. And yeah, I learned a lot. And and so I'm always interested in complicating narratives of emotionality and how, and this idea is still quite new and contested. Scholars in other disciplines might say, what do you mean emotions have a history? And there's one idea of romantic love, but I think that's what we have to offer this field, and Erika being in history and me focusing more on literary studies. Yeah, that's how we kind of started working together
that's
by discovering emotion studies through the German Studies Association.
That's wonderful. We will talk further about your field, but before that, let me ask Erika. I heard that you were recently appointed to the Illinois State Commission on Holocaust and Genocide. Shall we talk briefly about your appointment and what it entails?
Sure. The commission, from what I understand, is being, I'm not sure exactly what the word is, but let's say re-envisioned. It's got some new directors in place who are at Northwestern University, which is not too far from me. And we have a relatively new governor in the state. And I think he's quite interested, given the political climate in the United States, to address some of these topics. He's also a person of Jewish ancestry. So from what I understand, the commission is meant to really serve as a resource for pre-secondary education in the state. So public education, mostly at the middle school, and I'm assuming high school level, and to really help teachers get access to resources and best practices around Holocaust and genocide. I know that when I've had history education majors in many of my history classes, they are dismayed when I teach 20th century history, which we know unfortunately includes many, many genocides, and they haven't really heard anything about any of them. And they say, why aren't we learning this? We really need to teach this material to our students when we go out and teach. So I'm excited to be part of, I think it's a 17-member commission. They've got students on the commission, which I'm excited about, and people from all different kinds of disciplines and professions. So it should be a really good opportunity to educate and maybe even open or soften people's hearts, which something from emotion studies that I just want to bring in is emotions are universal. Whatever cultural knowledge, learning we have around it, it's something that my students can always connect to, and they can become curious about really quickly. And I think that it's a really great way in to teaching maybe some more difficult topics that do require a lot more cognitive development.
Wow. Holly, I got to know you from the Keywords Project, and you've been doing a lot of work in humanities education. So you've recently conducted an intensive writing course on humans, animals, and machines. It seems very interesting to me. Shall we also focus a little bit on your writing course?
Yeah, I'd be happy to say some more. I actually finished teaching two sections of that course this semester. It was taught fully online due to COVID-19, but I really enjoyed the experience almost as much as I enjoyed teaching it in the classroom, although I really miss the kind of the personal connections, the face-to-face interactions with the students. But in that course, so I developed it originally in the spring 2018 semester, so my second semester at James Madison University, and it meets a requirement for an intensive writing course focused on literature for the general education program here at the university. And so because I'm a Germanist, I wanted to focus on mostly German language literature, but taught an English translation for all students. But I included other works as well, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and some other 20th or 21st century science fiction works. And I shaped the course around the question, what it means to be human, what it means to be animal to machine. And these, I think, are increasingly important questions, because with artificial intelligence, with the increasing presence of machines we're currently able to communicate with each other thanks to Zoom and similar technologies. So I think these questions are becoming ever more pressing. And what I enjoy a lot about the course is I have a lot of interest from students in non-humanities disciplines, and they are from the sciences. Some of them might be studying robotics or engineering, and we have these kinds of conversations like the ones you're trying to cultivate in this podcast. So what is the value of the humanities? What does it mean to be human? And I think, yeah, in the future, these are the conversations we need to continue to have and to reach from the humanities across to other disciplines. And so, yeah, I'm so excited that you're doing this podcast, because I share these values. So this semester, I introduced some new literary works. One, a very recent German novel that was just translated into English in 2020, Marc-Uwe Kling's Quality Land. And that's a dystopian satire that deals with many questions. Would you trust a robot who is running for president of a country? And so, yeah, what does it mean to be human when we are increasingly relying on machines? What happens to our emotional and social relationships when we're relying more and more on technology? So I think these are especially important questions during COVID-19 times, the times in which we're living.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned COVID-19 and its impact, because this is just a general question to both of you. What is the impact of COVID-19, especially for your, conducting your studies, or possibly the relationship between humans, animals, and then the machines as you study? Erika?
Professionally, the college I teach at is quite small, and so we taught face-to-face. We weren't teaching remotely, so that was relatively unchanged. Of course, everyone wore masks, and it's still hard to read people's expressions in masks. And I've noticed, I think there's kind of a new sense of solidarity among researchers. I've gotten several requests from, let's say, very loose acquaintances saying, is there any way you have a copy of this book downloaded? Could you share it with me? And I too have been kind of thinking creatively about how to find sources, and frankly, hoarding books when they do come in. And, Holly and I have been talking quite a bit, writing this collected volume in the context of the pandemic, thinking about our attachment to our animals and how important our dogs are, and how I think they're all very happy that we're home almost all the time. And that, many of us, I've met Holly face to face, but at this point, I think you and I, Holly, have probably interacted way more often on Zoom than we have face to face. And we're dependent on this technology, and that's lovely. And it's also very frustrating when people forget to mute, or they forget to unmute, or they don't know how to use the technology. So it does feel like it's all very, very, very present, and something to be confronted, and I hope investigated.
Holly, what do you think?
Yeah, I second everything that Erika said. So I actually adopted, I wanted to adopt a rescue dog for a long time. I waited through graduate school and some years afterward. And I finally decided right before the pandemic lockdown started, I adopted 2 rescue Chihuahuas, which they might make their appearance soon if they're expecting a treat. So, but they have changed my life. They have made the pandemic bearable, more enjoyable while working from home. My students have gotten to see the dogs on our Zoom classes. And yeah, so I think, I mean, there are positive and negative impacts, I think, that we've seen in Erika and I. So at the end of the introduction, we wrote together for our co-edited volume, which I'm guessing you might ask us more questions about that later. We tried to conclude our introduction with our perception of some of the impacts on human relationships, on relationships between humans and non-human animals, and also machines. So I think, yeah, the technology has enabled us to continue to learn, to teach, to research during these challenging times. And also I definitely am relying on the animals to kind of, yeah, to give life a greater sense of meaning and purpose when travel and in-person interactions are somewhat limited.
Uh, Talking about the humanities with both of you, I guess studies German history, and we've seen fields like German history, German studies being defunded and being cut in the United States, which was also like probably one of the reason, probably due to the pandemic, or probably due to some long something that has been happening for long. Would you like to make this an opportunity to tell our listeners and viewers why German studies feels like German studies or German history matters, especially in the context of the United States, and why this is a field that should be, supported and brought, and more students should be brought into it. Holly, what do you think?
Yeah, this is a great question, Tilini. Thank you. Actually, I want to just acknowledge right now that there are some focus groups. I am a newer participant of a collective called Diversity, Decolonization, and the German Curriculum. And we have some focus groups to discuss exactly this question. So why or whether German studies and so how to communicate the value of our discipline more effectively, better than we have. So yeah, this is an important question. I think it's important to remember, or it's important to know in general, that German studies is not just about the German language. That's one aspect. German studies is a very broad field. So again, to just mention Erika's research as a historian, the German Studies Association in North America includes historians, musicologists, and literary scholars, film scholars, and German studies is also as varied as English literary and cultural studies. So we have subfields, not only emotion studies, Black German studies, gender and sexuality studies. So what I think our field has to offer is very similar to what kinds of courses students could take if they are English majors in the United States. And not only do we train them to be critical thinkers, readers, we teach them to analyze all kinds of cultural products, and with the additional skills required to do that in a language other than English, which might be their second, third, fourth language. And at James Madison University, we have students who speak also more than English and German. So I think, yeah, that is exciting. And I think a lot of students decide to declare a German minor or a major because they're interested in traveling. They see the value of the language skills, but also just the critical thinking skills that they can develop if they choose this discipline alongside whatever their other interests are.
Erika, you are a historian by training, and I would love to know how you articulate the crisis in the humanities, especially in your context, in relation to your research, your teaching.
I also want to just chime in and say that as an undergrad, I was a German area studies double major with history. So I second everything Holly said about, I loved being in that major. I took an opera class. I took, literature classes. I took German history classes. And it speaks to my deep love of interdisciplinarity. As far as, I don't know if I want to call it a crisis in the humanities. I feel like the humanities have been embattled for as long as I've had a professional career. Mm-hmm. And I'm very fortunate to be at a place where the administration really values humanities, and we've seen other regional universities cut humanities programs in the pandemic, and mm-hmm. It's just been heartbreaking. But I guess I'm feeling more and more convinced about the real deep value of humanities, just given all of the challenging circumstances that everyone is facing globally, and that the humanities allow us, they give us opportunities and windows to step outside of ourselves. And if I can just give some examples from my teaching, I've been so moved this semester. I'm teaching a Jewish history course for the first time. I got really interested in teaching, a different facet of the regular European history syllabus. Maybe it's decolonization of that syllabus, but I'm teaching this Jewish history, and I would say at least half of my class, the students were fairly devout Christians who didn't know much about their own faith's history. They just knew what they had learned in church. And so what we found out together was a latent and embedded anti-Semitism in much of what they had learned in church and in school if they went to Catholic school. And they were really, I think, taken aback by that. And by the end of the semester, I had students writing in their evaluations that they had really seen that they were seeing things only through one lens, and that could be potentially harmful. I'm really moved by this, and that they really were newly sensitive to vocabulary and words that they had never really interrogated before in their own faith traditions. And I think those kinds of openings are so important now. And I don't know other disciplines that could really give that opportunity for students to not only learn content, right, historical content, but also to have it reflect personally on them and have them bring that curiosity and openness to new texts or new encounters. I just think it's rewarding, but it's also necessary. And I think students really want to do that.
And I think, I just want to comment that I think Erika summarized that beautifully, and the focus on different perspectives and awareness of other life experiences, other voices is, that seems even more important given the kinds of social media bubbles that tend to form in online social media culture. And I think there's so there's even more of a need to expose students to always introduce new voices and perspectives, especially ones that are marginalized, and that's I think a great example with religious studies as well.
Both Holly and Erika just mentioned the recent call to decolonize. pedagogy and curricula. Erika, could you tell us a little bit about how that conversation happens in your field?
Something else about the pandemic and technology is many talks, webinars, panels, conferences have been available digitally that I never would have been able to attend. Mm-hmm. And I have been quite attentive in following these conversations about race, class, and the curriculum, for example. The Chronicle just sponsored a series. And I think that with the very, very visible impact of the dual pandemics, it's a topic that obviously has been a conversation for many years, and now people are much more present to the need for it. So I know, Holly mentioned that there is Black German Studies, and the German Studies Association also has been tracking for many years and produces their data about how many conference panels have women on them and how many have individual papers by women. So they've been tracking these kinds of efforts at inclusion for a long time. And I think one of the things that I've seen certainly in German studies is this slow awareness that it's not just about white middle class people who read Goethe. There's queer German studies, of course, and Black German studies and Asian German studies, right? So thinking more inclusively, and I think German studies in some ways is a much younger field than history. That process of examining marginalized voices really began in the 60s in the historical field, as far as, however, really decolonizing institutions. Tenured professors are mostly still white. I think that the proportion and the gender gap is narrowing. But if I can talk just a little bit about my small campus, we have an administration that's very interested in inclusion, and I think that the pandemic has allowed for more candor. Mm-hmm. I think that Zoom has changed academic culture a little bit. For example, we've been conducting searches for new positions, and people have been very transparent about, I've been quarantining and I wouldn't be comfortable coming to campus for an interview, and can I do it on Zoom? So this kind of candor, and I was really struck by all of the candidates talking very much about thinking about inclusion via Zoom, and how we need to be more compassionate and more, holding people accountable, yet giving way for difficult circumstances. So on my campus, we have started a working group about offering an intercultural competence course of study. And this is faculty driven. And to that end, we're actually going to deliver an assessment tool to all faculty to assess where they're at in terms of intercultural competence and communication, so that we can start having a conversation about how to really teach it to our students. Mm-hmm. The state of Illinois just came out with new secondary teacher standards, and they are extremely progressive. I was happy to see, how does your own positionality inform your teaching, and how might that inform how you interact with students who don't share your position or your identities? And so I'm really excited about it. And I'm going to say something that makes me uncomfortable, but I think it's true that, in order for this to really happen, we need to know it's a long-term process, and it's not going to happen overnight. And I think one of the trainers I respect so much at the Interdevelopmental Institute says, we cannot sprint. We need to warm up, and this is a marathon. So I'm very mindful about trying to meet people where they're at rather than where I or they want to be, and really having conversations that lay this groundwork to make more progress, like with my students saying, oh, maybe my viewpoint isn't the only one. Like that's a significant step that can lead to later conversations. So I am hoping that decolonizing moves in a way that can be absorbed, and I understand urgency. And I'm aware that my positionality as a woman of privilege, that's why I'm very uncomfortable talking about this, because I understand that my privilege, it's easy for me to say, let's go slowly, but I'm saying it because I believe that the system and the culture needs that gradual, compassionate process to really make the change last and really be meaningful and not produce a lot of backlash. So I guess I've kind of lost my train of thought, but I feel like there are conversations happening all over the United States and certainly in Germany about these questions, and the young people we teach, I think many of them, when they start to see the structural issues, they really want to make changes. And it's part of our job to help them see those.
Absolutely. Holly, you and Erika, have been co-editing a volume, putting together. I hope it was put together during the pandemic. Is it? Please correct me if I was wrong. So you co-edited this volume titled "Feeling Beyond the Human: Animals, AI, and Machines in Modern German Cultural History," which sounds very interesting. Shall we talk about this? How did this how did this initiative begin, and when are we going to see the book out?
That's a great question, Tony. So that's fingers crossed, wish us luck. The manuscript is complete. We are ready to submit it very soon. And that is the provisional title. I hope we can keep it, Feeling Beyond the Human, because of course it incorporates emotion studies, what it means to be human. It incorporates non-humans, and also the emotional or affective relationships between humans and non-humans. So that's the focus of the volume, and it sounds quite strange, but that is accurate. We did write, co-edit most of this during the pandemic. I think we really hit the ground running, writing the introduction a month or so after the lockdown started in our communities. And then I think the most intense phase of work was during our summer break. And we continued to edit during for me, the online fall semester. So it's been a busy number of months, but it's just been so much fun and such a pleasure to work with Erika, to learn from her, and to really, to put our heads together and think about this interdisciplinarily. The volume itself requires that way of thinking, because we're bringing together history of emotions, emotion and affect studies, robot ethics, technology kinds of discourses, animal studies, which there has been work in the field of non-human animal studies in German literary and historical scholarship, but we saw this volume as addressing, as kind of expanding that, because it is somewhat of a more developed field in Anglo-American literary and cultural studies. So I don't know what Erika wants to add.
Yes.
And I just want to extend my gratitude to Holly, because she's being very modest here. It's actually her idea that produced this volume, as far as I'm concerned. We had been working together producing seminars for the German Studies Association, and it was Holly's idea to come up with this focus. So I know you had been teaching the course, the Gen Ed course, or maybe preparing it, I can't remember, but I know that they were related. So it was her brainchild, and I thought it was a great, and like you said, somewhat strange and unusual topic. But it is just so interesting. And one of my kind of sidelines that I've been reading about, both professionally and personally, is I don't even know what to call it, brain science and emotions, philosophy and emotions. And the more I read about brain science and emotions, the more I'm excited about this volume. It seems so timely.
So yeah, this still couldn't have happened without you. I think the introduction, it drew on our varied skills, and so it's just been great fun. But yeah, so I do need to acknowledge my past Humanities 200 students at JMU, because they were very engaged. I've taught the course in spring 2018, and then I think we organized the seminar the following year, I believe. And at that time, it seemed like a ridiculous idea, non-human emotions and non-human relationships, but it really, I think it fills a gap, and it extends certain fields like animal studies in important ways. And so, yeah, I think Erika's enthusiasm also made me think that this wasn't such a strange idea, and that we could pull this project off. But yeah, in the humanities course, what I realized was that when I was teaching and asking students to consider questions of what it means to be human, how we relate to each other and to other beings, was that emotion was so central, because for centuries, if not the ability to reason or to think, then it became emotion that distinguished us from non-human animals, and then machines. But then with Darwin and others in the 19th century, then there were studies of, oh, well, actually animals can feel pain. And so then the animal rights movement started to change that. And now what's happening when robots seem to display emotions, or when they perform certain kinds of care work? We see now that robots are being developed that can assist patients in nursing care facilities, or work with children learning another language. So I think, yeah, these are important questions to consider. And so I hope that our volume will have an impact, and that we will work on maybe another project together after this, because we had such a good time on this, and I still can't believe we produced this during COVID-19.
Absolutely looking forward to the volume so much. Before winding up our discussion, I would like to know if you have any final remarks, Erika and Holly, that anything that I couldn't ask you that you want to add finally.
I guess I want to add more about brain science.
Yes, please.
I just finished reading Lisa Feldman Barrett's book. She's a psychologist, but she gives a lot of recognition and acknowledgments to the neuroscientists she works with. And her new book is meant for a very broad general audience. And I feel like so much of what's being discovered now really does squarely situate humans with other non-human animals, and all of those myths and stories that humans have made up for millennia about our difference and uniqueness really don't bear out. And I know that, or I sense, I don't know that I can really say I know, but I sense that there is a strong ethical imperative behind that for people in the neurosciences. And I'm just really excited about that conversation. And it too makes me think about the interdisciplinarity that I never would have guessed 10 years ago that I was reading something by a neuroscientist. There's no way I would have thought I would be interested in it. And to think that it has direct bearing on my own work now is very, very invigorating. And I know that there are some, brain scientists, medical people who also dabble in the humanities. And I just, I think those connections are so valuable.
Absolutely. Holly, any final comments or remarks before we wind up?
Yeah, well, perhaps I'll latch on to what Erika was saying about brain science. So I think similarly, when I was an undergraduate, I started off as a German and education major. And then I became really interested in psychology. Never ended up declaring a psychology major, but interestingly, I feel like I'm still able to do similar things, but historicize emotions and look at gender and non-human human interactions. So I think it's interesting how these fields in the humanities, they're interdisciplinary. They really allow us to have important conversations with each other across disciplines. And I think this is really the way to innovate, to talk with neuroscientists and psychologists and roboticists and engineers. And yeah, but I also want to acknowledge, so Tilini, how we met in Sri Lanka at the planning seminar for the Keywords Project meeting that unfortunately couldn't happen this past November due to COVID-19. But I want to say that the Keywords Project and Raymond Williams's Keywords really helped me to do the kind of thinking that I'm able to do now in terms of interdisciplinarity, looking at the meaning of words, looking at language as a site of contestation of meaning. So I just want to acknowledge my mentors and collaborators in the Keywords Project for kind of cultivating that and for allowing us to meet. And I can't wait to return to Sri Lanka and see you again in person when it is safe and possible to travel.
And possibly Erika could join Holly too. And
absolutely.
Yes.
I think it's the most beautiful country I've ever seen.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you, Erika, for joining with me today. It has been such an interesting conversation. It's the first time that we talked about non-human interactions, and it's the first time that we brought this conversation into the podcast. Thank you very much, Erika and Holly, and I wish you all the best for your future projects, your collaborations. And I'm sure you will, and looking forward to your volume as well. I'm sure we can meet in another conversation like this soon. Till then, I wish you both of you all the best.
Thank you so much, Tilini. Great to see you, Holly.